My name is John Bragg, and I'm the Coastal Training Coordinator at the South Slough National Estuarine Research Reserve in Oregon.
What has been your professional experience with collaboration?
At South Slough, we use collaboration in a number of ways, mostly in working with people and finding people who have common interests and are willing to put aside maybe smaller differences or other issues in order to work together for a common good. In our area, that seems to proceed fairly smoothly.
Tell me how the use of collaboration has affected your work, your relationships in the community.
Collaboration has taught me, in particular, how to trust people around me. I live in an area where there are a lot of contentious issues, especially over environmental topics. And by my nature as an environmentally oriented person, I often have been in the past suspicious of people on the other sides. I've learned a lot better how to, at least if not agree with them, appreciate their points of view and look for ways to meet them somewhere in the middle. In my area, we have a lot of controversial and contentious environmental issues, and a lot of people with viewpoints that are at least closely held, if not entrenched. And collaborative processes have taught me how to not only just hold my own opinions, but also respect other people's opinions and look for areas of commonality and trust where we can meet in the middle.
What have been some specific benefits of using a collaborative approach?
Some of the specific benefits have been an increase in trust and confidence in relationships among people in our community who are on different sides of issues. For instance, in our Partnership for Coastal Watersheds, we began working with small groups of people in small watersheds who lived in lowland areas and were very concerned about the implications of restoration for their local property, especially in tidally influenced areas. They worked in small groups to develop a sense of trust and a sense of common interest. And in our partnership project, those people have come together in a larger forum, and they are continuing to develop those trustful relationships. And we can tell that because they're staying involved in the process. They're not coming to a meeting and saying, that's enough, let's go on. And we can also tell that they are opening up to the ideas that it's not just maybe an environmental group against, say, a farmer group. It's groups of people who share common dangers or common negative influences on the landscape that we all want to avoid, or we all at least want to have some control over.
I'll ask the question again. Can you tell me about a specific barrier in using a collaborative process and how you overcame it, or what you plan to do to address it?
There's a barrier that exists in our collaborative process working with watershed owners in the lowland areas around Coos Bay in a project that we call the Partnership for Coastal Watersheds. Surprisingly, the barrier does not seem to be between the partners. Do you want to wait? Yeah.
Great.
That's right. Keep rolling.
It was the rolling part. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. There's a barrier that I see in a collaborative process that we're using out in Oregon at South Slough, and that involves the instigators or the driving forces behind our Partnership for Coastal Watershed. The partnership began with a process that was developed by our local watershed, the Coos Watershed Association, which was described as the coffee klatch process, which involved bringing small groups of landowners together with common interests to discuss on a very intimate and close basis commonalities and problems and potential areas where the environmentally oriented groups and the agriculturally oriented groups could work together. The barrier that came about is that process was very closely guarded by the Watershed Association because they had a process that was working. It was a very experimental process, and they didn't want anything to come in and make the process any more difficult than it might need it to be, just in case there were issues that came up that were too sensitive. Unfortunately, that has carried over into our larger partnership for coastal watersheds, which involves many of the same players and also involves the same organizations that are sponsoring or moving the process forward. And the Watershed Association still has a tendency to want to keep a bit of a closed door. But the closed door is not so much to the people who are being addressed in the collaborative partnership, but rather to other parties within the organizations sponsoring the program. So there's a little bit of a tendency to keep a closed door, for instance, to certain members of the South Slough team who is participating in the partnership, and it's not an intentional or an obstructionist type of a barrier. I think as much as anything else, it's just a barrier of habit and maybe not even a conscious awareness that there's a barrier, and with a little more say nudging, there might be a realization that there's a little bit of a blockage here and that the process would be better served if that blockage didn't exist.
Okay. Question for us. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm. Well, on the issues of barriers, I actually have a question that I would like to ask, and that is how partners in a collaborative effort should address a barrier between the partners. Case in point, our work in the Partnership for Coastal Watersheds at South Slough is kind of suffering from a little legacy that came from a process that went before us. Our partners, the Coos Watershed Association, developed a very intimate, personal environment in which they could have conversations with landowners about sensitive issues. They called it the coffee klatch process. And in order to make that work, they wanted to have an inclusive, but at the same time a very closed group of people who would be willing and able to talk without fear amongst each other. That has carried over into our larger process. The coffee klatch was one of the basic elements of our Partnership for Coastal Watersheds, but the tendency of the Watershed Association to try to keep outsiders out of the intimate discussion parts has led to a barrier in the sense that they are uneasy about letting certain members of their own partners, the South Slough Reserve, participate. And so we're just looking for ways that we can ease past that barrier and have a fuller working relationship with our partner.
And we're rolling.
Well, we had a process that is, let me start over. Just go ahead and keep rolling. All right, okay. We're involved in a watershed restoration process right now that involves several partners and a lot of local landowners, mostly agricultural people. Our process has run into a bit of a barrier that's kind of a legacy left from another partnership collaboration that preceded this partnership and has kind of grown into it. The previous partnership, for very good reasons, was exclusive of certain kinds of people. In other words, the project was aimed at landowners in tideland areas in our lower basin.
I'm going to cut. You're giving too much detail.
Yeah. Okay.
You were all... Okay.
There's a barrier that we're dealing in a collaborative project right now that suffers from the legacy of an earlier process. Without going into too much detail, that process was necessarily exclusive of certain people. That exclusivity has unfortunately carried over into our new project, not through the fault of any individuals or organizations. I think it's just simply as a matter of habit. And we're struggling trying to figure out a way how to get past that barrier at this point.
What might others in the system perceive as barriers to the collaborative process that are not really barriers?
Working with other people. Oh.
And you can just start with the rephrasing of what, you know,
Right, yeah.
a barrier might be.
A barrier might be, right?
As somebody might think.
Some people might think that the barrier to collaborative processes or collaborative learning is just simply the fact of working with other people and developing trust. But I don't think that they should think of collaborative engagements as being something new or something unusual. If you think back through the history of this country through the 20th century, we've been doing collaborative learning and collaborative projects all along. And if you look back to the early days of, say, Hoover Dam or Grand Coulee Dam or any of the big reclamation or water projects that were built in this country, nobody went out and planned them, and nobody went out and looked for templates or other guides. They just simply got together and said, we need this, let's do it. And projects happened. So I think collaboration is something that human beings know how to do. What they really don't know how to do in our particular age is trust each other.
Jim, what would you tell others in your position or in coastal management in general who are hesitant or skeptical about collaborative processes?
I think the most important for people to think about if they're worried about getting involved in a collaborative process is that there's really nothing to be afraid of. Don't be afraid to speak your mind. Don't be afraid to hold your viewpoints. And don't be afraid to listen to and consider other people's viewpoints. They're all people who are not trying to be right or wrong or domineering. They're people who are trying to solve problems and look for ways to get things done. And that's a common thing that we have. So focus on the things that you have in common with people rather than the differences.
Again, in your view, what is the most important thing to doing collaboration well and making it work?
The most important thing is don't get involved in a collaborative effort unless you are serious and unless you are intending to carry through it. And don't be afraid to carry through it. And
Okay, all right, let's just count to three. In your view, what is the most important thing to doing collaboration well, to really making it work?
put your fears and your doubts aside, and once you're committed, go all the way. If you want to get involved in a collaborative process, I think the most important thing is to commit yourselves to it, then put your fears and your doubts aside and jump in and have fun. Comes of that is you find that the people who you might have thought were your opponents in important issues actually will become your friends and your confidants in other issues that may become more important in the future. Now, outcome to the process is, of course, better land management and restoration opportunities, especially around land use change and climate change, and also just, again, a greater degree of trust and communication among people in the communities. But I think we've kind of hit that.
I do too.
Yeah.
Okay.
And when I think about what collaborative learning is about and what it needs, I can't help but keep coming back to the idea it has to build trust, and that trust has to last. And that trust has to become strong enough that it overcomes doubts and insecurities. Mm-hmm. And so it keeps coming, I can't help but keep circling back to that. And that means, staying in touch with people and talking, and probably not only even talking about the things on the agenda, but how are your kids, and did you recover from getting your dog getting run over, and those other kinds of, building those neighborhood associations with people.